Hello again, 102. In this video, we will go over the major new social and cultural trends and movements of The Clash of Cultures, Chapter 22, and we're talking about the Jazz Age of the 1920s. And this was a term coined by the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald. We'll see a picture of him in a moment, to characterize the spirit of rebellion and spontaneity among young Americans in the 1920s. He's largely talking about urban elites, ladies and gentlemen. And it's a spirit epitomized by the hugely popular jazz music of the era. And there you have a picture of Duke Ellington's band. They're probably playing at the Cotton Club in Harlem in New York City. And this music emerged in the 20s as an especially American expression. And this will be very popular in Europe as well. And this is a modernist spirit. African-American artists bent musical conventions to give freer rein to improvisation. And that's what jazz music is about. These individual musicians improvising on their instruments and trying to bring more feeling into what it is they're playing, and individuality. And this was a hugely popular music of the time. And in 1925, an African-American journalist announced that jazz had absorbed the national spirit, that tremendous spirit of go, the nervousness, lack of conventionality, and the boisterous good nature characteristic of the American, white or black. And Harlem in New York City and Chicago's South Side, these are two areas where jazz is percolating from. Large dance halls in other areas met the swelling demand for jazz music and the dance craze that accompanied it, including new dances like the Charleston, the Black Bottom, whose sexually provocative movements shocked traditionalists. But many Americans were not fans of jazz, because it was also part of a revolution in manners and morals that had come about, mainly due to the influence of Sigmund Freud, the founder of modern psychoanalysis. Freud's writings on the subconscious, dreams, and latent sexual yearnings captured the attention of many Americans, especially young adults. Again, the urban elites more than anyone, ladies and gentlemen. Much of the shock to old-timers during the Jazz Age came from the revolution in manners and morals among young people, especially those on college campuses. From novels such as This Side of Paradise, as well as dozens of magazine articles, middle-class Americans learned about the hidden world of flaming youth, the title of another popular novel, wild parties, free love, speakeasies, skinny dipping, and petting in automobiles on lovers' lanes. A promotional poster for the 1923 silent film Flaming Youth asked, "How far can a girl go?" Other ads claimed the movie appealed especially to neckers, petters, white kisses, red kisses, pleasure-mad daughters, and sensation-craving mothers. Wow. Freud, who was a trained physician, he's from Austria, changed the way people understood their behavior and feelings by insisting that the mind is essentially and mysteriously conflicted by unconscious efforts to control or repress powerful, irrational impulses and sexual desires, or their libido. And it didn't take long for his ideas to penetrate society at large. Psychoanalysis soon became the most celebrated and controversial technique for helping troubled people come to grips with their psychic demons. Through talk therapy, that's the psychoanalysis, patients discussed their inner frustrations and revealed their repressed fears and urges. This is why people have problems. They're repressing these urges. And it's one of the reasons why then people begin to let go and live it up, so to speak, and embrace this jazz age, because that is a way then to avoid mental illness. Don't repress these feelings and thoughts. And by 1916, there are some 500 psychoanalysts in New York City alone. And there's the first couple of rebellion, Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald. Zelda was the daughter of a strict Alabama judge, and she was letting go all right. And this is a picture of them on the French Riviera in 1926. F. Scott, The Great Gatsby was another famous novel of the 20s that was written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Young women, emboldened by gaining the right to vote, sought other freedoms as well. The empowered new woman of the 20s eagerly discarded the confining wardrobe of their frumpy mothers, pinched in corsets, choking girdles, layers of petticoats, and floor-length dresses in favor of more daring attire. In 1919, skirts were typically 6 inches above the ground. By 1927, they were at the knees, and the shortest ones were worn by so-called flappers, young women who, in defiance of proper pre-war standards, drove automobiles, bobbed their hair, cut it short, requiring the invention of the bobby pin, and wore minimal underclothing, gauzy fabrics, sheer stockings, and plenty of makeup, especially brightly colored rouge and lipstick and smoky mascara. They also often joined young men in smoking cigarettes, illegally drinking from a hip flask located underneath these short skirts, and gambling and shaking and shimmying to the sensual energies of jazz music. And there are flappers defined, the rebellious women of the 1920s. But most women in the 20s were not flappers, however. The majority of women remained either full-time wives or mothers or household servants. Fortunately, the advent of electricity and electrical appliances that we discussed in a previous video made housework quicker and easier than it had been for their mothers and their grandmothers. African American and Mexican American women faced the greatest challenges. As a New York City newspaper observed, they did work which white women would not do. Women of color usually worked as maids, laundresses, or seamstresses, or they worked on farms. The Harlem Renaissance is another cultural movement of the 1920s. It was the nation's first self-conscious black literary and artistic movement centered in New York City's Harlem district, which had a largely black population in the wake of the Great Migration from the South. And the writers celebrated African American culture, especially jazz and the blues, as Langston Hughes wrote, "I am a Negro and beautiful. The night is beautiful. So are the faces of my people." He loved Africa and its cultural heritage, but he declared, "I was not Africa. I was Chicago and Kansas City and Broadway and Harlem." And James Weldon Johnson, a poet, lawyer, and civil rights activist, coined the term Afro-American to design Americans with African ancestry, whom he called conscious collaborators in the creation of American society and culture. And by 1930, the Harlem Renaissance writers had produced dozens of novels and volumes of poetry, several Broadway plays, and a flood of short stories, essays, and films. A people capable of producing such great art and literature, Johnson declared, should never again be looked upon as inferior. The Universal Negro Improvement Association was founded by Marcus Garvey. He is the first exponent of black power, ladies and gentlemen. Garvey's ideas of racial separation and pride resonated with many African Americans in the 20s and beyond. But his crusade would collapse in 1923 when a court convicted him of mail fraud related to selling shares of stock in a steamship corporation. He wanted to see African Americans go back to Africa. And that's what his scheme was, to try to finance a shipping company to take people back. And he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he was later pardoned by President Coolidge on the condition that he be deported to Jamaica, where he died in obscurity in 1940, but the memory of his movement kept alive an undercurrent that would reemerge in the 1960s under the slogan Black Power. And again, to recap, we have jazz music, the Harlem Renaissance, the beginnings of Black Power, and women's rebellion symbolized in flappers as huge social, cultural trends and movements of the 1920s. With one more, last but not least, the NAACP, an organization founded in 1910 by black activists and white progressives that promoted education as a means of combating social problems and focused on legal action to secure the civil rights supposedly guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments. And W.E.B. Du Bois became the organization's director, and they're focusing again on legal action through lawyers and bringing suits in front of the Supreme Court. And they will be successful in bringing a few cases to the Supreme Court. And they're very interested also, and the last thing is they launched a national campaign against lynching, which was still a common form of vigilante racist violence. And an anti-lynching bill will make it all the way through the House, but it will be defeated by a filibuster of white Southern senators. And that ends this particular part of Chapter 22.